Welcome to Impact Farming, where we introduce you to the people and ideas that will have a massive impact on your farming operation. Brought to you by Farm Marketer. Sit down, start the engine, and let's roll with today's show.
Have you serviced your farm's most important asset? Soil is your most powerful machine. See more at smartnutritionmst.com.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Impact Farming Show. Today, we have an amazing returning guest. We have Michael Langemeier from Purdue University. Welcome back, Michael. How are you?
Pretty good. How are you?
Good. I'm so happy to have you joining us again as we start to dive into our transition planning series. We're doing a deep dive into it. And you're one of my very first episodes where we're really laying the foundation for going back to the farm and being intentional about it. And I don't think there's a better conversation to be having than, is it feasible to go back to the farm? So before we dive in and talk about this explosive topic and open the can of worms, do you want to tell our audience a little bit about who you are, your background, and what you do?
Yes, be glad to. I was raised on a crop livestock farm in east central Nebraska, and then I went on to get a bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the mid-'80s. It was a very difficult time to find a job, but I'm not too sure I really wanted to go into industry anyway. I liked the academic life. And so I continued on to get a PhD at Purdue University and received that in 1990. And then I spent 22 years at Kansas State University working in farm management, production economics, and agriculture finance. And then I had an opportunity to join the Center for Commercial Agriculture at Purdue in 2012, and I haven't looked back since.
Nice. Lovely. I am very happy to have you. You're a numbers guy, you're a money man, and you have the agriculture background. So to me, those are my two passions in bringing that farm business finance information and that agriculture. And where those two meet, I think there's so much power in powerful conversations, and especially as we go into transition planning. I'm going to lead you into this. I think sometimes there's an assumption because we are the fourth generation and we like farming, we just assume we're going to go back, and maybe we don't think about it. We're excited because we're that young generation. I want to talk to you about the Debbie Downer version, I shouldn't say that, the more realistic. Let's have the conversation. Is it feasible? So I'm going to get you to start off with some of your experiences that you've seen, students you've worked with. How do the next generation tend to go back to the farm and the mistakes that are made? And then we'll flip to what you would like to see and the conversations that should be happening. So do you want to chat about that a little bit more?
Yeah, let's briefly talk about some of the common mistakes. One of the mistakes is to make assumptions that so and so is going to go back to the farm, and vice versa. A young person thinking, well, there's going to be a farm for me, without really communicating that with the older generation. In many cases, on today's farms around the world, there's several families involved, and so there may or may not be room for you to join right away. Maybe you'll have to wait a few years before you can join the operation. So assumptions can be very dangerous. That's one of the things that I always talk about. Make sure you communicate your intentions and vice versa. Make sure the older generation discusses this, how they think you fit into the business. And so that's a common mistake. Another mistake that's easy to make is to jump right into what entity do we need. This is usually the case if there's only one or two families farming already, and then a young person, either Joe or Jane or whatever, wants to get into the business, and right away they think about what entity do we need to use for this new operation. That's important. Don't get me wrong, but there's several things to think about before you think about what new entity you need, and so that can be another common mistake.
Okay. Perfect. So why don't we dive in? You've seen people do it successfully. You've seen some mistakes made, and you're really passionate about the concept of, is it feasible to go back to the farm? So why don't we high level dive into why is that probably one of the most important conversations that families should be having?
Yeah, and you can make a couple relatively simple calculations using some thumb rules that I've developed, but also are commonly used in production agriculture to look at this feasibility. And certainly going slower rather than faster is always a good idea when you're thinking about that. That's why do this feasibility before you start thinking about entities, before you start thinking about transferring management, before you think about transferring assets. And so there's a couple things I usually look at. Well, actually, three factors I typically recommend that people look at. One of them is gross revenue. How much gross revenue does the current operation have over a long period of time, not just in the latest year, but over the last 5 years, last 10 years? And I have a rule of thumb there. It takes about $500,000 of gross income, that's in U.S. dollars, per worker. So that could be per operator or per hired employee, and so that's kind of a rule of thumb. And so if you're not at that level after you've added the young person, then you need to think about what are we going to do differently to generate more revenue on this farm, and we can talk about that a little bit more here in a little bit. The other factor I have them think about is what is the profitability been on this farm. We can use a metric that's pretty easy to calculate. If you have accrual net farm income. But if you have accrual net farm income, you can look at net farm income divided by gross revenue as kind of a gauge on profitability. That's easier to calculate than a lot of other financial metrics, and it is one of the financial metrics that people recommend, that people calculate on a regular basis. Again, looking at a longer run average, it makes a lot of difference whether that farm has a 20% net farm income ratio. And so net farm income represents 20% of gross revenue, and that's before you subtract any owner withdrawals out of that. And so you need net farm income for owner withdrawals, repaid debt, and other uses versus 10%. It's obvious, but you have to calculate the profitability. You have to calculate the gross revenue and compared that with other farms. Do we have enough gross revenue for each person that's going to be involved in this business, as both operators and hired employees? And are we profitable enough? And if we're not, what's going to change when this new person comes back? That's going to all of a sudden increase the gross revenue, increase the profitability. The third factor is related to both of these, and that's to take a deeper dive. And this gets more complicated than the first two factors. It took a deeper dive and look at the net cash flow, kind of an expected net cash flow using long-run gross revenue, long-run net farm income. And what we're trying to do there, does it look like the cash flow is going to give us enough money to cover all the labor compensation of the operators? That's one of the primary things you're looking at. To repay debt, we may have to borrow additional funds to buy assets if a person's coming back. Do we have enough money to repay debt? And do we have enough money to replace assets? And so I kind of look at those in order. Does it look like our long-run cash flow is large enough to cover operator labor costs? And we need to pay the new person something, and we can talk about that a little bit more. We have enough money to repay the debt, and do we have enough money to replace assets? And if the answer to any of those is shaky, meaning that it doesn't look like gross revenue is very high in this business, we're going to have to do something different, or profitability is a little bit low, or it doesn't look like we're going to have enough funds to cover all of these things that we need to cover, then they need to step back and think about, is this not the right time to come back? Is there some things that we can do differently? Renting additional acres. In Indiana, or where I'm at, one of the common things that someone does when they're coming back to the farm is looking at contract swine production or contract laying hen production. So can we build a livestock barn that's going to increase gross revenue? Is there something we need to do differently to overcome these three factors?
Okay. So before we get into the deeper dive into the financial, I just want to really do a shout out, and I know you've touched on it, on the importance of financials to make these decisions. It's almost a no-brainer, and you can touch on that as much as you want or as little. And communication. You personally did a farm transition plan, and it sounded like, if I remember your story, you guys were very deliberate, clear, organized. I would like you to touch and just do that friendly little reminder about the importance of knowing your financials and talking about it thoroughly and quickly and sooner rather than later.
Quite often when I talk about transition planning, I'm talking to the older generation, and then when I'm talking to students here on campus, I'm talking to the younger generation. So I do talk to both groups. When I'm communicating or discussing issues with the older generation, I always tell them, be as transparent as you possibly can be. You know, what your plans with both those that might be coming back to the farm, but also those that are not going back to the farm. Have a plan. People get upset when they don't know what's going on, and you spring it on them. You say, well, this is how this is going to work if you come back to the farm, and then the person coming back to the farm says, what? I can't make this work. And so try to have try to think ahead when someone still is still in high school or even junior high, and think about what it would look like, what it would need to look like for this person to come back to the farm, and think about how you're going to transfer your assets when you die. Those are all very important issues for the person coming back to the farm and the people not coming back to the farm to know what's going to go on there, because without that information, it's very difficult for the person coming back to the farm to really assess where they stand with regard to the business. And in my personal case, that my parents had decided really early on how they were going to transfer assets, and my brother went back to the farm, and so that was very fortuitous for him that he knew exactly where he stood, but also my sister and myself also knew where we stood, and so that worked out really well. I've seen situations where that's never really discussed, because sometimes it's painful for people to talk about these things, and it's never really discussed, and the person that came back to the farm fairly recently really doesn't know where they stand. They don't know if the farm has a substantial number of acres, and there's three siblings, including themselves, whether they're going to get a third of those acres, whether they're going to get half of those acres, and how that's all going to work. And so be as transparent. I always tell the older generation, be as transparent as you possibly can be. And then I always tell the younger generation, it's your parents' decision. And so you can't get too obstinate about this and too pushy. But it doesn't hurt to ask them, what are your thoughts, Mom and Dad, about how this is going to work if I come back to the farm? What can I expect to happen? But make sure you approach the older generation in a very polite manner, because it really is their decision on what they do with those assets, and you certainly don't want to upset people because they thought you were too pushy there, and it looks like you're trying to get a larger share of your assets than Mom and Dad is comfortable with giving you.
Yeah. I like to say I'm a translator for the generations, because I'm not the parent, but I'm old enough to understand how I would feel and the financial implications if there was a next generation coming in. So I'm old enough to understand my parents' generation, that the ones that are transitioning out of the farm, but I'm also young enough yet to understand the ambition, the drive, the passion, and also maybe and I say this with all due respect because we're all there, the ignorance of youth, where you don't quite get the money concept. You're passionate, and sometimes maybe that comes off the wrong way, like you said, like pushy. So I like to say I'm a translator for the generations, and you're right. There is nothing worse than lack of communication in any relationship, and especially in a family farm. To me, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, the dollars are too big nowadays to be willy-nilly. And Here's my onus to the farmers, us, you in the audience. There's too much information out nowadays, shows like this, newspapers, that we have that prior generations didn't have. There's no reason for us to be making these same mistakes that our grandparents and great grandparents made. It's a different world. The onus is on us, right?
And I've talked a little bit about the farm assets and thinking about transferring the farm assets. Another thing that's very, very important for both generations to talk about is what is the main source of mom and dad's retirement income. A lot of farms own a substantial amount of ground, and they really can't transfer that ground during their lifetime because that's what they're living on. They're living on that rental income, and so all of that matters. When you're talking to the younger generation's talking to the older generation, is it's not just farm finances you're talking about. You're also talking about personal finances, particularly for the older generation, because they have to think about, what am I going to live on? A lot of farms that I know do not have a lot of money outside of production agriculture. They don't know how to have a 401k. That's something they don't even know what that is necessarily. They don't necessarily have those things. Their assets are what they've invested in the farm, and there's nothing wrong with that. Land has been extremely good investment over the years, and so that's been a really wise choice by investing money in land, at least in the U.S. and in the Corn Belt. But that needs to be communicated to the older generation, and the younger generation also needs to think about is they probably have an opportunity to do something other than come back to the farm, and so they need to think about well, what is this farm going to pay me, both short term and intermediate term, compared to what I could get working someplace else. And it's not going to be the same. It's going to be lower because we've got this term that we like to use in production agriculture called sweat equity. You don't necessarily get your full worth of your effort. Particularly in the first few years, you're learning the business, and over time, you're hoping that the assets you invest in, particularly land, appreciates, and you build equity. You build part of your equity based on that appreciation of land values, and also the income that you're reinvesting in the business. And so there's both a personal and a business side of this finance that's pretty important to think about and discuss among the generations.
I love it. I think you nailed one of the most important points. And when I started this show and started speaking to wise people like you and looking at friends and family that are trying to transition, there's a lot of maybe sometimes common sense or mystery, common sense that's missing, mystery that's filled in these conversations. And I can see it. And if you're in the audience, I have a feeling this might be your situation. You're the young generation, you want to come in, or you're working on the farm and you want to transition the farm, but the parents are reluctant, but nobody pieces, and to me it's such common sense, but nobody pieces together the conversation. Well, son, daughter, if I sell you the farm, I have no income. We have nothing in the bank. They may or may not. You're right. A farmer's majority put everything into the farm. And I think that's changing, and I like to bring that conversation. Let's invest offside or insurance policies, whatever it is. But let's face it, I know many farmers that wanted to retire, but there's no income there. So I'm going to almost guarantee the fear of the situation and the embarrassment are holding people up. So until we can figure out how to take care of the retiring generation with funds from buying the farm or a wage or whatever it is, that conversation's not going to go nowhere. And hey, I've had this happen personally.
Yeah, and another thing that I should mention that's really important when we're communicating the younger and the older generation, make sure everybody that has a stake in this, talks about what their personal goals are. And I've done training, and you're probably involved in trainings also, where you separate the older generation by spouse, and you separate the younger generation. Maybe the younger person coming back to the farm is married, and you separate the younger generation by spouse. Guess what? Neither the two spouses of the older generation or the two spouses of the younger generation are necessarily thinking about the same thing. And so this is really important to make sure everybody communicates. Maybe mom is expecting dad to retire at a certain age so they can visit the other kids. They can travel more. That's a classic example. The new person that's coming back to the farm, maybe his wife is not from the farm and really doesn't understand, what their family is committing to, and so it's important to talk about these things.
You know what? You've just hit the nail on the head 100 times over. We're killing that nail, Michael.
Yeah,
it's
good.
True. But the funny thing is, we laugh. But what you just said there, in a few of those situations, and especially the expectation between spouses and lack of communication, I know that personally and within friends and family. So we laugh, but that's what's happening. And I'm so happy to bring on guests like you and have these conversations. Back when we started farming, or when you would have went to the farm if you were going to farm, the knowledge floating around that we have now wasn't there. With conversations like we're having right now, we're giving the next generation and the older generation tools and permission, guidance, questions. So I love these powerful conversations. So
yeah, and if you think back to like, my parents are now deceased, but you think back when they started farming, they didn't know much of anything.
Yeah,
we're getting into, there was very little conversation at all, and so it's certainly improved over time. We've developed some of these concepts and encourage people to think about some of these concepts before they get into the business. And it goes back to something you said earlier. There's so much money at stake now. You don't want someone, a younger person, to pull up roots. They've been working in Indianapolis, Indiana, or something like that, have a good job, and not fully understand or realize what they're leaving by leaving that good job. And there's just so much at stake these days compared to 40, 50 years ago. Not that there wasn't quite a bit at stake there, but the numbers were much smaller, 40 to 50 years ago. And then there are also something I mentioned earlier, many times these young people are going into an operation where there's already 5 families. And so it's not just one older generation, one younger generation. What you decide to do in terms of coming back to the farm and how you fit in is impacting multiple families. And so if this doesn't work out, it could be a headache for all of those people, not just your parents and yourself and your spouse.
Oh, I love it. And sometimes maybe I feel in the content we share, it comes from negative, but it's not. It's things I see, and I want to flip the conversation so that farmers can be successful. I have seen there is a beef farm from out west in Canada, and I know numbers of what cattle are worth and calves are worth. So I know land, you get a good concept of what that farm brings in. They had 4 or 5 families taking a wage, like taking a living out of that farm, and probably at max it could support 2. So nobody was quite living like they needed to, and nobody was happy, but there was no deliberate conversations. Everybody wanted to be there, right? And that's how we are in agriculture. We just want to continue on that legacy.
Now, one of the options, and this was true where I grew up too, because I was in eastern Nebraska, where there is some off-farm job opportunities, and so farming part-time is an option in eastern Nebraska. But certainly, my wife grew up in the Panhandle of Nebraska. That may not have been in the cards. But one of the real advantages of where I'm currently working and living in East Central, in the Eastern Corn Belt, is there is off-farm opportunities. And so we don't necessarily have to think about, going back to the farm and farming full-time. There is that intermediate option. Well, I'm going to try to find an off-farm job that's close to where this farm is, and I'm going to slowly but surely, getting into this farm business, see how I fit, to see if this is going to work for me. That's particularly important if it looks like the gross revenue is just not there to support 2 families. This occurs a lot of times when there's an older generation farming and they're the only ones farming, and then we're trying to bring in another person. Well, that's doubling. That's doubling the amount of families that we're trying to support. That's a big change.
Yes.
There might be work, as you know, there's always enough work on the farm and in small business to spread that work over two families, but there might not be enough gross revenue, might not be enough profit coming out of that gross revenue to fully support two families. And so we need to mention that there is that other option where we come back slowly and we start as a part-time farm.
I love it. And actually, an interview that's going to be airing right around the time as this one, we're talking about reimagining coming back to the farm. And with the technology and the internet and how easy it is to set up online stores, we now, as farmers, can have side hustles. So there's so many where my grandfather would have went to the farm, where Anthony's dad would have went to the farm. Options were limited. It was kind of in or out, but now there's so much potential. So,
and it's really exciting from a younger generation standpoint, because there's so much technology that's on board here in the next 10 years. And another thing that's really different about today's world compared to even a generation ago is you have the opportunity on these large farms with multiple families to specialize. And so if you're a person that really likes finances, you're a person that really gets excited about marketing plans, if you're a person that really gets excited about the technology, there's good opportunities for you to be that person on the farm that's responsible for that management area. And that's so different than it used to be. I mean, you go back 50 years or so, everybody was wearing these hats, of all these different, job responsibilities. And so specialization is really changing how we work on these farms.
It is. It's neat. It's very exciting. There's so much potential and great conversations, great opportunities for the next generation. So that's why I like these conversations on helping bring the next generation back so that everybody's successful. So that is a great segue into the bulk of what I wanted to talk to you about. We could dive into ratios and a whole lot of stuff really deep, and those are things that need to be done. But if somebody's looking at the financial feasibility of going back to the farm, can you touch on a few of the core things that you would say, hey, son, daughter, this is what we need to be looking at?
And this would be doing, first of all, do a pro forma analysis, or do an analysis assuming that the person's coming back to the farm. And so don't just use historical, information. And even though that's important, try to do some what if scenarios. This person's coming back to the farm, and so you're looking at what the potential gross revenue is, what the potential profitability. And so I go back to my three factors. Calculate what that gross revenue per worker is going to be after the person comes back, using maybe 5-year average gross revenue on the farm. Maybe putting some extra in there if we're going to change something in the business as a result of someone coming back. You do the same with profitability. If the farm in the past has not calculated accrual net farm income, this is an opportunity to do so. Let me talk a little bit about how to do that. If most farms have very good cash flow data because they need that for tax purposes. And so if we combine that good cash flow data with a good balance sheet, which is required by most lenders if you're borrowing any money, you can combine those two things and calculate accrual net farm income. We've got publications on our website, Center for Commercial Agriculture, but that's also available elsewhere. How do you take that information and calculate accrual net farm income? Once you have that, calculate this profitability. Does it look like we're going to have this 20% net farm income ratio when I come back to the farm? And then do that net cash flow. Does it look like the net cash flow is going to be big enough to cover labor, to cover paying debt, and to buy assets? One of the big problems on farms, that's why I talk about this repayment capacity, this net cash flow quite a bit with younger people. I encourage them to think about this. From a expectation standpoint, is a lot of farms don't generate enough cash flow to fully replace all the equipment they have on the farm. And what happens on those farms is they're not in a position to add a person to the farm ever. But the only way that young person could come back is when the older person retires and that younger person takes over. And so that's why I talk about that. If there's not enough cash flow there to replace the assets specifically related to machinery and equipment, grain bins, buildings, maybe expand a little bit, then it's a non-starter. It's just not going to work. And again, don't use just 1 year information. Try to come up with longer term averages to do these calculations. And again, the things I'm talking about are not that out of line from what the information that people have. If you have good cash flow information, and you can use that to do some cash flow projections, and you have a good balance sheet, that's going to take you a long ways in terms of calculating this gross revenue. Gross revenue per worker, calculating this net farm income ratio, calculating this repayment capacity measures. I mean, these are not complicated measures once you have the data.
Okay, excellent. And it's funny because if we were to bring a son or a daughter back to the operation and they wanted to work full time, we'd be expecting to pay them a wage and they would be expecting it. So we would know income, expenses, we'd have to pay whatever, a couple $1,000 a month right there to junior, right? So we know that cost is there. But what you were saying, very, very simple calculation. The first step would be, we got to pay them their wage. What can we afford? So you're almost saying, well, if you can do that, but there's no more room to replace different assets, then that's probably...
That's a problem. That's a big problem. And because typically when someone comes back, you need to expand. And so at a minimum, you need to be able to replace the equipment, but you need to buy additional equipment. You're going to need more equipment or larger equipment. Maybe you need some swine buildings. In the example, if you're going to diversify into contract swine production, as an example, you're going to not only need the capital, the capital for that. You're going to need to replace the equipment you currently have, and so you need to make sure you have enough cash flow to cover the equipment side, the building side. In addition to having enough money to pay a salary to the new person.
So that's almost kind of, to break it down really simple, 3 levels. And
yes,
some we might not even think of. So the wage, the improvement and replacement of assets. So if you got to buy a new tractor, that costs on top of paying juniors wage. And then number 3, assuming we had room in those financials to pay for that and not expand, good. But if there wasn't room and we have to expand, well, in our situation, we're cattle farmers. So we would need 30, 40 more head to pay that wage. And then now we need that land to graze them. So you either rent. So it's funny, one little cost. We want to bring junior or juniorette, is it? Junior could be either. I'm not being male or female here. If we want to bring in the next generation, it's not as simple as just the wage. It's a bit of a spiral, isn't it?
Yes, and I never used to think about this. It's called repayment capacity measures. This net cash flow. I never used to think about this too much. I always focused more on profitability in the past. Lenders are the people that always talked about repayment capacity because they obviously want there to be enough net cash flow to not only pay the people but also to repay debt. But I've really encouraged farms and people in transition to really think about this repayment capacity, because this is where the rubber hits the road. If the net cash flow is not big enough to cover these things, it's not going to be a viable farm. It may not be viable for the person to come back now. It may not be viable for the person to come back 5 years from now if nothing changes. And so this is just important things to think about before you make that commitment.
You're so right. And I'm being transparent here and really open and thinking about this. So let's say we have the next generation coming back. Now it's not only those 3 costs, it's actually, like you said, the cash flow too. So now we're a cattle operation. We sell our calves twice a year. So we have enough credit or off-farm income to cover our costs for the month to live. So now the next generation comes in and that farm is paying them a wage. Well, they got to pay monthly. I'm pretty sure we got to pay monthly. I'm pretty sure junior is not okay getting paid once a year. So now as a fourth level, we're looking at extended credit. How, right? If there isn't a spouse that can cover costs over there, we've now added a couple thousand exactly right to the, and where's that come from?
Yeah, and even if you thought you had enough machinery for a while, maybe the older generation has recently purchased some machinery and they think it's sized appropriately to add acres in terms of renting or buying. Even if that's the case, think about if it's a grain farm, the operating capital you would need to rent additional acres. Probably a bigger operating loan. It may even mean borrowing some money on land that we own to generate more cash flow, and so that's why you want to think about where the current net cash flow is, but also think about this expected cash flow after the person comes back, because really when you're thinking about expected cash flow, that's the first step in thinking about whether changes need to be made to the operation. So in your case, that's the first step to think about. Do we need to have more cows? For a grain farm like in Indiana, which we have a lot of them, not only do we need additional acres, how many additional rented acres do we need, and where are we going to get those? And so that's something that really needs to be thought through. And a lot of the younger generation do a really nice job on this. I have quite a few people that talk to me where they said, I've got this opportunity. This person is going to retire and they want me to rent an additional 320 acres. And then we ask ourselves, is that going to be enough added to what the older generation already has for me to come back to the farm? And that's thinking about it more in a realistic fashion, because usually the farm is not big enough without doing something additional for that person to come back.
I agree. Yeah, and you know what? There are so many, like we said, great resources, great university programs, and the kids, not kids, I feel like they're kids, but the next generation that's coming up, they're so smart. So it's great to see them.
Yeah, one other point I should make, and this goes back to the personal goals again, and when I talk to students, we kind of laugh about this, but it's a very serious matter, is I ask that I talk about risk. And specifically financial risk, and I ask them, does your willingness to take on additional debt differ from your father's, differ from your grandfather's? And they just laugh. The reason why they laugh is as a person gets older, the father or the grandfather, as they get closer and closer to retirement, they want to pay their bills. They want to pay the debt off, not take on additional debt. And so this is a very important conversation, that the younger and older generation has to think about. And really, they both have to compromise. You're probably going to have to take on some additional debt, probably both operating and more intermediate term or long term in the form of buying land. They're probably going to have to take on some additional debt, but that does put a brake on the younger generation, saying, let's expand slowly rather than fast. But that's a good idea anyway. I always recommend, unless there's that opportunity where you have 320 acres, you either take it today or you're not going to take it. But that's usually not the case. Usually we're talking about incremental changes to these operations. And so it's always wise to do the incremental change rather than try to gobble up a big change by borrowing a lot of money.
I could see how that would definitely be a big source of conflict, right? Again, I like to say I'm in the middle, and I said this prior, I'm in the middle of that older generation and the younger generation. So I have the hunger still of the youth. I'm still young enough that I'm hungry and building and we're expanding. But I'm starting to get that a little bit older where you go, okay, do we need to? Do we want to? Right? You're just kind of in that middle. So I understand both generations. And I can now clearly reflect back and go, wow, when kids come back to the farm at 20, 25 and guns a-blazing and they want to take over the world, how that could really just cause some conflict and get some heads spinning, because those are two different generations, or three.
Yeah, sometimes the older generation, now this is probably more like 2 generations ago.
Yeah.
The older generation has that mindset that when I get out of agriculture, I don't have any assets, farm assets are transferred to somebody else, and I have no debt. That's not the way farming works today. When you're transferring a farm from one generation to the next, there's going to be some debt. The assets don't need to be transferred right away. In fact, land does not need to be transferred quickly at all, because that's an important source of retirement for the older generation. So sometimes it's addressing that mindset that some people, not all of the older generation have this mindset, but some have that mindset. When I get out of agriculture, I should have no debt. Well, if you have an operating entity and you're farming with several other family members, including some younger family members in that operating entity, what difference does it make if as long as you get your shares paid for by other family members? What difference does it make if there's quite a bit of debt when I leave the business? And so it's a change of mindset that I'm not liquidating my share when I'm getting out of agriculture. I'm just reducing my time spent and from a labor standpoint in agriculture, and I'm going to slowly get out in terms of transferring these assets to the younger generation or to other family members.
Love it. That's some great points there. So, okay, we covered a lot on the financial end. Where else do you want to go? I know you could probably go 10 different directions and 10 layers deep. What else would you like to share here?
Well, one of the things that we kind of inferred earlier in our conversation is compensating the new generation. So let's talk a little bit about that. And there's no one size fits all by any means. But one of the things I really discourage people from doing is first of all, trying to change the entity or get a new entity right away. Move slow on that and think about some other things. And then once you have more information on how this rest of this is going to work, then go ahead to the attorney or your CPA or both and think about the appropriate entity for what you're trying to do. But when you do that conversation or do that exercise in thinking about the entity, you also need to think about compensation. And one of the things that I discourage people to do is to jump with both feet and say, okay, this new person's coming back. Now we're going to divide the income between the younger generation and the older generation. I like to see a trial period, and it varies depending on the maturity of the younger person, depending on the attitudes of the younger generation and the older generation. I like to see a trial period there where the younger generation is actually paid a salary. Now, again, that salary is probably going to be lower than what they could get working in an agribusiness or working someplace else, but paid a salary for a year or two. Make sure that they're committed to making this work. And then once that's done, once we form the entity and we know how profit's going to be distributed through this entity, then we can start worrying about dividing income between the younger generation and the older generation. So kind of a test period.
I like it. And one of the things we did in hindsight that I really liked, when we started farming, Anthony's parents were beef farmers already, and both of us were working full time. And his parents were kind and gracious enough to allow us to start in. And we bought our first group of 10 cows, right? Yes. And we worked. And Anthony continued to work. And then we kept some heifers back, so your herd grew. And then we still have income coming in. And then eventually it comes to that tipping point where we go, yeah, we're in. Yes, we're creating a lot of work here where it's not fair to put this on his parents. The income coming from the cattle are now enough to replace his wage. Let's jump.
Yeah.
That's what we did.
Yeah, I'm not discounting the importance of doing exactly what you're talking about on a grain farm. What a lot of people do, and this is a really good idea, is they let the younger person make all the decisions on maybe 80 acres or 160 acres. It depends on how big the farm is, but take a small part of the operation, maybe a specific landlord. A lot of landlords like to rent to the younger generation, so maybe you picked up some land, and that land is going to be rented directly to the younger generation, and they're responsible for making decisions on that 80 acres or 160 acres. Maybe in addition to the salary they're getting, some of the profits from that acreage could accrue to them. And so give them some incentive to really manage that well and increase their base salary. And so you can be quite creative when you do this. And I really encourage people to do both. Maybe think about a base salary for a couple of years. That way also the younger person doesn't come in at the wrong year, if you will. We've had some years from 14 to 19 in Indiana here where the income has not been very good, and so that not be a good year for the young person to come in, and there's almost nothing when it comes to dividing the income. And so maybe starting with the base salary, but have something like incentive to maybe manage a small piece of the operation and get more profit on that. When I was back in Kansas, exactly what you're talking about was really common with cow-calf producers, is to start with a small share of the cows, 10% of the cows or something that you own, and then gradually build that up over time.
Yeah. I like it because, again, hindsight, as I'm a little bit older and we've made some mistakes, I wouldn't want to put that burden or that risk of saying, okay, here you go, you're straight out of school, run the whole operation, right? Because I don't care what kind of agriculture you're in, there should be a mentorship. There is just big dollars, big decisions. You get gung-ho on an idea and then you go, oh, wow, that was not a great idea. There's a lot at stake. So I like these conversations.
Another reason why the base salary is important to start with, at least something there, is I've seen a lot of situations where the primary income source for the older generation does not necessarily come from the operating entity.
Okay.
Money's kept in to expand the farm. It comes from the land that they own.
Okay.
And the younger generation doesn't have that, and so they don't own any land, and so that's really not going to work until the younger generation has more of an asset base build up, so that they're getting income both from the operating entity, dividing the income, dividing the profits, and their ownership in things like land, and so you want to get that person started right, and I just think that's probably certainly in a situation where the older generation is getting most of their money from land that they own, that just makes sense to me. And personally, I've seen some situations in my extended family where that was the case. They needed to compensate the younger generation, at least have a salary there, because the older generation did have large land ownership, and that was a major source of their income. Well, to even things out, you need to pay the younger generation a base salary so that they have something other than a division of the profits.
Okay. That is a lot of great.
Complicated, but that's really important to think through. And that goes back to the personal and business finances. You need to be clear on where people are how profitable the business is, but also where does the older generation currently getting their money? And if it's mostly coming from that land ownership, we got to do things differently than if they didn't own very much land and most of their profit is coming from the operating entity.
I love possibilities, and I also love black and white. And I love if we could just say, XYZ, this is what we do. But we know every single person in the audience that's watching this, their farm is totally different than every single one of the neighbors. So these ideas here are great guidelines and opening up our mind and not being cookie cutter. It has to happen all at once in this box. Just all the different potentials and ideas there are for the next generation coming in, right?
I have three daughters, and they're not all identical people.
Yeah.
And so if any of those were coming back to a business, I would do it differently depending on which daughter was coming back to that business. That just makes sense. I mean, it's the personalities involved. It's the situation on the farm that make it very unique. And so you're right. Just taking a cookie cutter situation from another farm in the area, and that might have been very successful for that farm. It may not work for your farm. That's why it's nice to think about options and communicate different options between the generations.
Excellent. Wow, we covered.
What I don't want to see is if the younger generation really does not know what they're getting involved in, and they don't have full information when they enter the business, and they spend 5 years, in some cases miserable years, working in that operation and have nothing to show for it. Luckily, I don't see those cases all the time, but we still see those cases, and that's what we're trying to prevent. By applying these transition planning concepts, is to try to ensure that that doesn't happen on our farm.
Amen. And that is exactly why I have these conversations. You know what? We need clarity, and the most important part that we all know, this is a family farm operation. So if we go in and it doesn't work out and it wasn't thought out and there's grudges, lack of clarity, we're not just quitting a job and leaving. These are people that we know, we love, and we got to have Christmas with. So to me, I've seen the good, the bad, the ugly, and the phenomenal transition planning, and that's what I want to happen, because at the end of the day, the farm's important, but the family is even more important, right?
And there is that brings me up to another story. There is a right time and a wrong time to have these conversations. The classic wrong time is when everybody's home for Christmas or everybody's there for Thanksgiving, and then somebody gets really angry.
Yes.
And so I'll always tell the older generation, think about what you want to do, in terms of both the younger generation that might be coming back and the younger generation that's not coming back, and then give that some thought, and then approach each party of the younger generation separately, and then talk to them as a group. That way you don't ruin the Thanksgiving, and somebody gets mad and never comes back to another Thanksgiving. Let's try to avoid these conflicts where people don't talk to one another again. And you've probably run across that too. I've seen situations, luckily not in my family, but I've seen situations where something goes wrong and the parties really never talk to each other again. And so we're trying to avoid that.
I am right there with you.
One of the things that makes this difficult, and I'm a very quiet person myself, and so I understand this fully. What makes this difficult is a lot of people that are farming or in small businesses in general are not necessarily marketing types. And what I mean by that is they like to keep stuff inside and don't necessarily talk about things like feelings and some of these what they call soft issues, if you will. Need to get past that. We need to get past that and just say this is going to be good for everybody that we have these conversations.
Michael, I'm almost speechless. And for the marketing type, that's amazing accomplishment. Here's the thing. You hit the nail. I love our conversations. To me, the lack of clarity on how the income's going to be handled for the older generation, and that is reason number 2. The soft issues, I know it. I've lived through it. I've seen it. If we are dealing with people like me, it's easier. I'm more extroverted to talk about this kind of stuff, have the conversations. It's still awkward. And if you don't have the answers, you still avoid these conversations. But I look at family and friends that farm, and they're not the talkative types to begin with. And they don't want to cause confrontation. And to me, those two things, lack of clarity on the plan and the income and the details, and communication. And I think that's why people avoid this planning so much. And it's heartbreaking because not having the conversations doesn't fix it. It just causes resentment.
And I go back to something I said earlier, because this is so important. We don't want this to stifle the process either. Is that the older generation is simple? We have an older generation and a younger generation, so there's two families. Make sure that the older generation talks about their personal goals with each other, because they might be different. What one spouse wants to do in terms of transferring assets to the on-farm heir, if you will, is different from what the other spouse wants to do. And so that needs to be figured out before the younger generation comes to the farm, because they don't want to be shocked that mom and dad get in an argument because they can't agree on how this is going to work after they're gone. And so those things just need to be discussed up front and make a decision. And usually it's a compromise. It's usually a compromise of some sort. This is a topic for another day, but the fair versus equal, that we have. How do we divide assets between the on-farm heir and the off-farm heir? That's just something the older generation has to think through before they talk to the younger generation, both the on-farm heirs and off-farm heirs.
Oh, I love it. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you, Michael. We are going to work to wrap up the conversation. Unfortunately, I could go into fair and equal and hard conversations, and then we could probably dive back to financial. I'm sure we could talk for hours. Thank you for sharing. If people want to connect with you or get some of those resources that you mentioned, how can they connect with Purdue University?
The Center for Commercial Agriculture houses our webinars, our podcasts. We have both a monthly webinar that's primarily outlook oriented, looking at the WASD report that comes out every the middle of every month. We also have podcasts, including podcast episodes on transition planning, and all of our papers, all of our short papers, if you will, are housed on the Center for Commercial Agriculture website. And so just type that into your search engines, Center for Commercial Agriculture, and check out our resources. I would like to advertise in particular. I spent quite a bit of the summer and early fall writing 20-odd pieces on finance. And so if you want to know more about financial statements, financial ratios, cash flow, contingency planning, all these topics related to finance that we've kind of brushed on today, check those out because it goes through examples and example calculations.
Okay. What I will do, I'll get links to all of that and I'll include it in the show notes for our audience so that they can find you, the university, and click over to those specific resources. That sounds amazing. Well, you know what? I'm sad that our conversation is ending, but I wanted to thank you and thank you for the work you do. Our next generation of farm kids are in great hands with teachers like you. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. I enjoy it.
Excellent. And thank you for joining us on another episode. If you liked it, please like it, share it, subscribe, and really get it out there so other farmers can hear the great wisdom from guests like Michael. Thank you and see you next week. Bye-bye, guys.
You've been listening to Impact Farming. For more great episodes and articles designed to help you manage and grow your farming operation, head on over to farmmarketer.com. Don't forget to sign up while you're there. We will see you on the next episode.